Hello and welcome to Grocer Pod. My name is Sean Kosednar. This week I'm talking with IGA's President and CEO, John Ross. We're going to discuss employee recruitment and retention. Before we get to John, I want to remind you to please subscribe to Grocer Pod. Subscribing means new episodes will be downloaded for you each week. You can find Grocer Pod on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube Music, or any other platform you use to listen to podcasts. Thanks for joining me today, John.
I'm always glad to be here.
Yeah, John, so why don't you give all the listeners, an overview of the labor market as it stands, in July 2024?
Well, it's certainly a completely different labor market than I grew up in. And as I started my career, what it took to hire people and to motivate them and train them and then get them to stay seems like radically different today than it was even just a few years ago. I think one of the mistakes you could make is to look at the craziness of COVID over the last few years, right? And it certainly was crazy, and it disrupted everything in our economy, including the labor markets. And then look at the current environment and say, well, all the weirdness or the difficulties I'm facing are 100% due to COVID. And there are some COVID hangovers in the labor market, and we'll talk about that as we go along. But you really, really do need to get your head back into 2019 and 2018. And think about, was it easier then to hire and attract people than it was the year before or 10 years before? No, it was harder. We were complaining about it back then. And if you go back pre-COVID, the mix of people in our stores were very different. It was harder to recruit young people than it had been in years past. Getting seasonal labor in, that was more difficult. And then retention, it was harder to get people to stay in these service jobs than it was, say, in the previous decade or in the 90s. So there were macro trends that were moving even before COVID. And COVID came and disrupted. So what all that means is we do have to look at the current labor market through the lens of how the worker's mindset has changed. Because if we can understand what they're seeking and what motivates them, then we can build a labor strategy to win. And then, of course, what's most important about that is that you don't presume that everything is just a hangover off of a period of COVID where a lot of people could sit out of the workforce, so they're getting these artificial subsidies, and suddenly now that money's gone and they're all going to come rushing back to us. It won't, because their brains are different in how they think about jobs. And I'll have some data for you as we go along.
Yeah, so I think that's super interesting to think about. So what is the mindset of the worker, in 2024?
Yeah, so IGA, we're a retailer. We're an alliance, and we provide services for independent retailers all over the world, 6,500 stores and growing. So we're really connected into labor markets everywhere, which means we're constantly looking at the differences, what's happening by country. And I can tell you, it's really fascinating. No matter where you go, if you were to visit an IGA in China or in Australia or in Fiji or in Poland, right, you're going to find a lot of the same issues. You're going to find that it's harder to get people to apply for jobs. It's more difficult to get them to stay. It's difficult to motivate younger workers. And the policies that we had in place don't seem to work with younger folks. And also the other thing that everyone is discovering is just throwing more money at the problem doesn't seem to solve the problem. Certainly, it's more expensive. And everywhere it's more expensive, right? It's more expensive to hire today than it's ever been. But more expensive doesn't necessarily improve all of your metrics. So that's table stakes. You got to be competitive, but you won't solve your problem just by raising your labor rates alone. There's a lot of other things that you need to do. I'll give you some really fascinating stats. So if you go back to 2018 and you were to say, how many people in the United States were engaged in the gig economy? So Uber or one of the food delivery services, or had an Etsy store and they were selling things on eBay or whatever, right? Like, what percentage of Americans, and what is that percentage to today? So that was less than 10% of people were using the gig economy as either a replacement for a regular job or in addition to a regular job. I'll talk about that in a second. That was less than 10%. And today that number is over 30%. 1 in 3 Americans participates in the gig economy today. So So the competition for labor, especially for service level jobs in restaurant, entertainment, and retail, the competition for labor, it's not just us versus Kroger or us versus Chipotle, right? It's us versus all these other minimum skills required gig economy jobs, and that's brand new. And so the first thing you got to do is get your head into the standpoint that in order for me to recruit people or get them to stay, I better know what my competition's offering. I better understand why people are loving those jobs. And just as important, why they flee them, because there's a lot of reasons. There's a dark side to all that gig economy stuff. And so that's how you put together a value proposition. The second thing that's interesting is that, for many years, for teenagers, for young people, the primary driver to getting your getting your first jobs and to working in these seasonal labor jobs, and many of us started off as teenagers working at retail. I did, right? And our whole industry is filled with them, right? Primary motivation was to be able to afford insurance and to afford fuel and to buy a car. Because for most of modern U.S. history, car ownership equaled freedom for a young person. Today, fewer and fewer 16-year-olds get their driver's license. We're down at a 20-year low, and the number of 16-year-olds that even go out and apply for their driver's license. And you have a large number of up-and-coming teenagers, so this is the 13 to 15 range, that say they're disinterested in driving. And what's happened is where the car used to equal freedom, today, with a mobile phone and a little bit of cash and an Uber account, you've got as much. You can stay connected with your social group today without having to own a car, pay for insurance, go down to the DMV and get your license right. You don't have any of those risks. And so the motivation for a lot of young people to engage in the workforce is less today than it was when we were teenagers. So you got more opportunities in gig economy. You got this change in the mindset of very young people. And then amongst adults, there's a change. And so if you go out and you survey people and you ask the question, like, what motivates you in what you do? Like, what's the, like if you were going to make a choice of switching from job A to job B, what would cause you to change? And this is really interesting. So in your head, you're going, well, more pay. And in fact, everyone's going to say, well, if it's more pay, that's good. But it's actually not the number one answer. The number one answer is more flexibility. Okay, that same survey done 10 years ago or 20 years ago would not have had flexibility in the number one slot, and today it does. And so for whatever social reasons, right, in our economy, all workers, young, old, middle-aged, they're all saying the ability to manage my schedule and to have more flexibility in how I work is increasingly more important, which may explain why you see so many people looking to the gig economy as a replacement job or as a second job. I find that fascinating. I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, me too. And it makes total sense, because what's the selling point for, driving for Uber or driving for Uber Eats or DoorDash or whatever is you get to pick when you're working and when you're not. And it doesn't have to be the same every day. You don't have to decide before you switch on the app that you're working now. And so that makes a lot of sense to me. And then, the working from home for, the portion of the pandemic where everyone had to, and, a lot of businesses are still, allowing workers to work from home.
Mm-hmm.
If you have a position that's 100% in person, I bet workers are going to look for something that they get to be a little bit more flexible on that. And so how do AWG member retailers, offer some sort of flexibility? Obviously, you can't stock shelves from home. So you gotta be there to ring up people at the check stand. So they don't have that in terms of flexibility. Do they have any sort of flexibility when it comes to scheduling?
Well, yeah. I mean, so either a retail sales force is the most flexible kind of environment, or we're inflexible. It depends on the attitude of your store manager and our hiring managers. It depends how you think about it. So the reality is that we have long hours in retail, which means you have multiple shifts. And we are open 7 days a week, which means you can shift things around by day. And if it weren't complex, you got 200 people working in your store. If you had some sort of AI engine working for you, you could help optimize the work schedule based on what the store needs and what your employees need. And you could sort of trade back and forth, kind of like deal a meal, right? You could kind of trade these things back and forth and create a really flexible schedule for people so that they can take care of doctor's appointments or take care of their kids or school or whatever they need to do. In theory. The reality of that is exceedingly hard. Managing those work schedules is really, really difficult, which is why so many retail systems are the exact opposite. They're inflexible. These are the hours I get. This is when I need you. This is when you have to be here. There is no discussion. And so somewhere between the complexity of a perfect solution and the simplicity of a rigid solution, somewhere in there, there is an opportunity for us. And there is emerging technology that has come out. There are apps that are available. Some of your retailers are using them today that allow you to push the flexibility down into the associates' hands themselves. You let them trade their schedules back and forth with bumpers, with rules. You don't make them all chasing around the assistant store manager or the HR manager begging for a change instead, but you give them more visibility into how the schedules are done, and you allow them to interact with each other with rules that let them make changes. And what's fascinating about that software, and by the way, is not expensive. Every one of our independents could afford to update that. What's great about it is it has 3 huge benefits. The first one is the assistant store manager or whoever was doing all the hiring and the workforce management. It's a huge relief off of their shoulders. They're not just constantly being chased by people begging for a change and having to say no. The second thing is the employees feel like they have more control over their life, and that even if it isn't that flexible, the visibility into how the decisions are made doesn't make it feel like it's some sort of bureaucratic process, right? They can see how it works, and so by making it exposed, they get to participate. And then finally, they end up negotiating amongst themselves in a way that, hey, I've got this doctor's appointment. Could one of you switch your schedule? The store manager wasn't going to run around asking people about that, but they will. And so they end up becoming more flexible themselves as they go through the process. So it's one of the examples, and we see it in a lot of our stores where a simple technology can sometimes have a huge benefit in solving a complex problem.
Well, then I wonder, because they're talking to each other versus going to the assistant manager, what's that do to store culture and just employee culture? Like, I have to figure that like they're going to feel a lot more interconnected with their coworkers because they're helping each other out. Like, oh, I did something for John, and now John's doing something for me. We're all in this together. Versus, oh, I have to go track down the manager and hope that he just goes into the void and pulls out a replacement for me.
So, there's so much more involved in this big idea, right? If you look at big companies, so I'm always curious, like, how does Home Depot solve this problem? Or how these big companies, not only have they invested in technology that allows people to dialogue with each other and apply for a change in their schedule where someone else can say, hey, it doesn't matter to me, I'll switch with you easily. That kind of democratizes some, not all, some of this. Not only does that happen, but something else happens. And that's exactly the question you ask is, the technology now allows you to create a social media experience, a walled garden one, a controlled one, right? Where now people can start dialoguing about a lot of stuff. And these HR portals, if you go to Home Depot, there's a big HR portal, or Kroger, an HR portal. And in that portal, you can see the upcoming holidays. You can see store policies. You can click on those. And there'll often be these little chat windows where someone can talk about other stuff other than labor or HR. You can say, hey, I'm struggling with, I don't know, the trash hauling service. Is anyone else having a problem with that? Or how are you guys, the new freezers have this reset button and I can't get it to work. Has anyone figured out a solution for that? And they end up, when you connect people with each other who have like jobs and are trying to solve the same problems, you end up creating this the unintended consequences is a more fibrous connection between people who are really doing the jobs, and magic stuff can happen out of it. There is a downside. You do have to curate it. You have to pay attention to it. You can have one really loud vocal voice who's upset with their boss or upset with the company, right? So you have to have some curation. You have to have someone on your team paying attention to it. You have to handle it with respect. It's no different from letting customers comment on your website. You got to pay attention to what they say, and you have to respond, or it can be bad. But the positives overwhelmingly for all of these big companies outweigh the negatives in terms of both creating culture, creating an innovation space where people can solve each other's problems, and making the scheduling process feel less autocratic.
Well, and those conversations are going to be happening anyway. Like, they're happening in the storeroom. They're happening, on the floor. It doesn't matter. Like, they're happening. At least now you can see them and respond to them as the manager, and hopefully then fix the issues instead of just letting them fester. And so this kind of segues us into, we've hired the people. Is it just as simple as adding a chat function to retaining them, or are we going to have to do something else too?
Yeah, so this is a big one. So let's go back. So let's look at some data again. So if you survey people who switched jobs in the last 2 years, so they had a job and they left it and they went to another job, and you say, why? Why did you switch? So flexibility and statistically money are tied. So people will either leave for a more flexible schedule, or they leave for more money or better compensation, right? But the number one answer is more meaningful work.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, if you did the same survey, look at the same version of this survey. There's a bunch of these out there that are available. I like the University of Michigan's labor study in America, but there's other companies that do this. There's a bunch of them out there. If you look at it, it's always whatever survey results get now are interesting, but it's kind of trivia. But if you can see what's trending up or down, that's really valuable, because that gives you an insight into how workers are thinking. And so if you were to look at it, and if you look at it 10 years ago, more meaningful work was still high, but it wasn't the number one answer. Okay, so you scratch your head on that one, more meaningful work. And by the way, the younger you are, the more important that stat is, more meaningful work. So I know when I started off as a teenager working, I needed money to pay for my social lifestyle, and my father made me. So there's two primary motivators, right? But I didn't expect meaningful work. I expected to be moving buggies and doing the worst jobs possible, and cleaning up the spilled milk in the back and all the terrible jobs, because I was an entry-level worker. That was one of my expectations. The expectations of people today have changed. Now, we could get into a whole social experiment about entitled young people or how the things are different and all the rest of it. Forget all that. That's irrelevant. It doesn't matter. What matters is what gets you more job applications and what keeps people to stay. And so if the number one reason why people are leaving your job is because they don't feel like their work is meaningful, what could we do to fix it? I think a lot of times we segment marketing, because as an industry, we're good marketers. The grocery industry, CPG's invented modern marketing as we understand it. We're good marketers, right? And HR, it's like they're two separate things. Think about marketing for just a second. So in the marketing world, what's the first question you ask when you're going to launch a product or run an ad? Who's my target? Am I trying to reach females? Am I males? Am I trying to reach people with children, adults, retirees, teenagers? Who's my target? That's the number one question. And then the second question you ask is, what do they think about my product today? And that's how you build a marketing plan. So if recruiting and retention are essentially marketing, if you imagine that your head of HR and your marketing person were the same person, right? How would they rethink how you communicate with workers? The first question they would ask is, what do my workers think today? Or, who's my target, and what do they think today? And then and then understanding what they think, then how do we solve their problems, right? And so this more meaningful work is really, really critical. Now, at the store, if you go out and you grab any AWG store manager, and you go, or in any retail manager anywhere, and you go walk around with them and watch how they behave. We've got great leaders in our company. And they're walking around and they're going, "Hey, Lisa, how was the weekend? How's your kid doing? Is he feeling better? That's great, right?" And walking back, "Oh, you did an incredible job in the deli last week." That everyone was just coming back. We could have sold 4 of those trays of potato salad or whatever, right? You watch how they behave. And a great leader, and you know it when you work for one, is like looking for opportunities to praise people about what they do versus the experience that most of us have had, which is a boss that seems to look only for areas to criticize.
Mm-hmm.
So you start thinking, you put your head through that and you go, wow, whether I'm an entitled Gen Zer or I'm an adult in my 50s or 60s, who wants to work for a boss that just screams at you all the time? Nobody.
Yeah, nobody.
Nobody. So this idea of more meaningful work, right? If you were to put that on the board in your room and go, well, what we do does matter. Right? We feed the hungry. It was clear in COVID. Our shoppers were coming hugging us and telling us we were heroes for working in those stores at the time. Now, it can seem like a grind, but what we do does matter. But then how can we invest the work they do with meaning? And that leads you to praise. And so if you were to look at your training materials for first-line supervisors, assistant store managers, for managers, and look at how you train them. And if you don't have training materials, you go to IGA because we do. They have a whole way to care training system and classroom courses and the rest of it, right? And there are other people that have them out there. But if you look at those training programs, how much of modern management training teaches you how to seek out opportunities for praise? And if you go back as a boss and you look in the mirror and go, how many times did I tell people I appreciated them or that they did good work where it was meaningful, it was real, right? How many times did I actually do that? And I think you'll find that most leaders in our industry, where we grew up in a culture of people yelling and screaming at you versus the way you really want to be treated, right? We have a long way to go. There's real opportunities for improving. I'll give you one more stat on this. If you ask people why, so this is what people who switch to a new job, why did you go to the new job? If you ask the same question, why did you flee your last job? The number one answer is not pay, it's not flexibility, it's not advancement. The number one answer is I hated my boss.
Yeah. So
if that's what's causing people to flee, and what's causing people to go is more meaningful work, then this is a gift to us. Right? So it doesn't cost money here. It's not a lot of money here to rethink how we train and how we motivate employees. And so when's the last time you did management training for your team members? Is that training up to date? This idea of looking for opportunities to praise publicly as opposed to humiliate, right? Have we created a system where we reward people for performance publicly, but only censure privately? And if you don't have that as a system, and you're not using this, not only are you out of touch with your own workers, but you're also creating an environment where you're going to have people flee. And I have one more thing to this, one more stat on this.
Yes.
And that stat is, so it's not in the question, why did you leave your job? So I hated my boss, or my boss wasn't respectful, or boss whatever. Number 2 is opportunities for advancement. We can talk about that in a second. But number 3 is training. So people want to come to work for a company that's going to, and I'll invest in you if you invest in me.
Mm-hmm.
The stores in our system, so in IGA, we've got 2,000 stores in the United States today, 2,000 plus. And if you look at the stores that have the highest usage of the training system, so they're training their people, which is free to IGA retailers. And I think AWG has the same system. And if they don't, we'd be glad to work to make sure all AWG retailers have it. IGA, we're a not-for-profit. We work to help ensure that the retailers win. But it doesn't matter, right? If you look at the stores with the highest sales, the highest comp sales, the highest performance, they also have the highest uses of training and the lowest voluntary churn.
Yeah.
Trained people stay longer.
And the training could be anything, right? Like, oh, you're here being a cashier, but you have interest in floral. Like, okay, great. We're going to give you some training in the floral department or the meat department or whatever. I mean, the training could be anywhere, right? It doesn't necessarily have to be for, management advancement.
It's such a great point. So if you go to NGA or FMI meetings or something, and you're looking out at the audience, and you say, would you guys raise your hand? Who here started off as a lot boy, or a stock boy, or as a cashier? And let people all raise their hands. And that room is filled with presidents, CEOs, VPs, SVPs, directors, right? I mean, that's the leadership team of our industry. Every hand in the room goes up. So it's really interesting. We are an industry where you can come in an hourly position and you can work your way all up to become a CEO. It's not only possible, it's probable that the people that end up in senior jobs started off, or in the warehouse, they started off in, as a picker or whatever. We, unlike so many other industries in the world, we really value that experience from store level all the way up. And yet we bury that lead. We don't tell anybody that, right? Look at our Help Wanted ads. If you want a depressing afternoon, go pull the Help Wanted ads for retailers. And just not grocery, look at them all, right? And so many of them begin like this. They say, must be willing to work nights and weekends, must be willing to work hard, must like being yelled at all the time. I mean, it's terrible. I mean, it makes it seem like it's the worst job in the world. Imagine if you rewrote that, where you were to say, would you like to work for a company where you can start off at an entry-level position and work your way up into manufacturing, or go work for a sales organization, or go work in the warehouse or in logistics? Or our jobs can lead so many different places. We should be a poster child for opportunities for advancement. But we don't tell that story, and we don't tell it overtly in the store. And like you said, it could be, you're a cashier today, come in and do this for a while, this is where I need you. But if you have an interest in learning, how to cut meat, or you want to learn about produce, or you want to learn about logistics, or you're curious about my wholesaler, right, who's also hiring, right? There's opportunities for you to learn the food industry, and that path leads anywhere you want to take it.
Well, John, now you've mentioned this twice. So first you were talking about, marketing and HR being one, and now you're talking about the Help Wanted ads, and it got me thinking, in 2024, it's easier than ever to advertise on digital platforms, wherever, like very targeted ads. We do them with the digital circulars already, so I think stores need to spend a little bit more time marketing their open positions. And even if they don't have open positions, marketing their store culture and trying to get people to want to work there. And you can come up with a pretty easy 15-second spot of, this person started as a cashier and now they're a vice president. That you can tell that story very fast. And that, like you said, is a lot more, interesting to people than here's some money to come and work nights and weekends.
That's exceedingly well said, but let's push on it even more. So you remember that the reason why people went to a new job was more meaningful work. That word meaningful, it's got a lot of definitions. Part of it is you want to work for a company that seems to have a purpose in life. And so the average worker is twice likely to go to a company that's committed to some sort of higher purpose than a company whose purpose is only making a profit. Now, again, this is what people say. It's not always what they do. But if you know this now, so the idea of meaningful. Okay, so now let's take that job description. Let's rewrite that together for a second. Imagine if that job description said, how would you like to work for a company that feeds more hungry people in our community than anybody else?
Oh, wow.
How'd you like to work for a company that has cut its energy bills more than any other industrial company, in the last 3 years, which would be true in our stores when we switched from fluorescent bulbs to LEDs and modern refrigeration and all the rest of it. How'd you like to work for a company that supports every charity in my community? Because, in an average independent, who do we say no to when people come and say, I need help for my church social or my Boy Scout club? We say no to no one. We support everyone. Yeah, it's our DNA, right? We are a definition of a company that's engaged in its community. And then finally, how'd you like for a company that hires locally and keeps its money locally? Right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the definition of what we do. If it were me, I would begin my job description with that. And the first time I met someone, before I even talked to them about the job, I would be going through all of these advantages of what it's like to be what we do. And I would make sure that was really, really clear, because we've got so many great stories about what we do that end up buried in the, I need someone who will work nights and weekends and is okay working back in a cold room cutting meat.
That sounds great, John. So we're going to wrap up here because I know that you're busy. You got lots of stuff to go and do. We've talked about a lot of different strategies. Give the listeners 1-2 bullet points of if they were going to go out and recruit somebody today, what's the first thing that they should do?
Well, so you mentioned it before, but you talked about targeting. That's a great one. So there's 2 really great targets. Or there's 3 great targets for us. So the first target is the family members and friends of our own associates, paying a recruitment bonus to bring your buddy in or your cousin or whatever to work in the company. People won't bring their family into a business that they don't love already, and that's a huge endorsement. So that's one. Recruiting from your own shoppers. The people who shop you already love you, and recruiting from amongst them, saying, hey, if you love food and you like our store, how'd you like to be a member of a team? And so think about aiming your marketing at them. And then finally, the restaurant industry. So if you want to talk about kind of misery in jobs, the restaurant industry, especially people who work in the kitchen staff or in the service staff, those are long hours. They've got all the disadvantages we have, but it tends to be a much more caustic culture, and the hours tend to be even rougher. And so we have a huge advantage versus restaurant and grocery, especially in our deli and in our versions of food service, that they are much more palatable jobs. And then the other thing is training. Once you've hired somebody, invest. It's not a lot of money to invest and make sure that you're training. When you're doing it, you're telling them, I'm investing in you. I think that you're important. As their skills build, so do their confidence. And when their confidence builds, they're much, much less likely to flee than somebody else.
Those are great tips, and I hope that all the AWG member retailers out there put them into action. John, thank you for joining me today. I could sit and talk to you all day about this stuff.
It's always fun to be with you, and I'm really bullish on our opportunity in the market. I think with some tech, it's just kind of rethinking how we think about our labor. We've got huge opportunities here, so I think we'll win in the long run.
Yes, we absolutely will. And I want to thank you all for listening. Please remember to like and subscribe to Grocer Pod. That way you can stay up to date on all the latest things going on around AWG. Until next week, this has been Sean Kosednar for Grocer Pod.